Great. Thanks, April. Okay. So welcome everyone to the first Rulemaking Advisory Committee for the climate evaluation criteria that OWEB will be developing over the next several months. First, I really want to thank you all for agreeing to be on this RAC. It's an important one, and I'm really confident we have some great minds on this committee. So first, we should do some introductions. So what I will ask is if you give your name, who you work with or for, and also, since this is a climate RAC, just maybe a little bit about how climate change is impacting you, either personally, professionally, or how you see it might be impacting you in the future. So I'll start and then go around and call on people. So my name is Eric Hartstein. I'm the Board and Legislative Policy Coordinator with OWEB. Based out of the Salem office, live in Corvallis. And I'd have to say that wildfires have been something that have definitely been impacting me, both personally and professionally. Grew up in the Northwest and don't remember any wildfire smoke ever when I was a kid, and up until 10, 15 years ago now, it seems to be an annual thing, sometimes far worse than others. So next, I'll start with OWEB folks. So I'll go to Jesse and then April.
Good morning, everybody. I am the Water and Climate Programs Coordinator here at OWEB. I'm also in Corvallis, as you heard me say earlier. So I think the one that's most recent is probably the atmospheric rivers. Just because of our street, we've been getting a lot of flooding, and like in my neighborhood, almost to the point where we were having to put sandbags in my neighbor's driveway because it was flooding so far up to her garage, just because the amount of precipitation that fell in a really short amount of time. And there's a creek sort of near us, but the way that the drainage, it doesn't drain very effectively. And I think it just isn't the way they constructed our street. It's really old and just it's not built for this kind of amount of water at one time. So it's been on my mind lately.
Good morning, April with OWEB. I am Executive Director Assistant to Lisa and Assistant to staff. I would have to agree with Eric as far as the wildfires go, affecting me personally, and also just seeing the community around, because I live up in the canyon where the huge fire was, and I just see a lot of people panic anytime somebody's doing backyard burns, or especially during the summer when they do field burning. Everybody is really, really on edge, wondering, what's that smoke, what's going on. So people I think, have a little almost PTSD on just the fire itself. So it's sad to see how people are just really on edge, continuing. It's like they can't, kind of relax and move forward, which I totally understand. But, and then personally being able to actually go out to the areas that have been burned, because, a lot of them are closed off, so you can't get out there. So for me.
Great, thanks. So next we'll go Bruce and then Guy.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Bruce Taylor, and I'm here because I'm representing the Agricultural Heritage Commission. But otherwise, I'm retired. I'm on the board of the Oregon Desert Land Trust. I worked in bird and biodiversity conservation across Oregon for many years. So I've been watching the climate change stuff. Positive side is, and I used to work a lot on oak habitat conservation. This is really good for oaks. When you see those Douglas firs dying of drought and disease out here in Western Oregon, that means you're going to see the oaks popping back out if they survive the next 100 years here. But I also work in Eastern Oregon, where you can see it's hard to sort out what's long-term drought and what's climate change, but all those things around fire and drought are pretty pronounced.
My name is Guy Sievert, and I am a board member at the Nestucca-Neskowin Sand Lake Watershed Council. Also current president of the Network of Oregon Watershed Councils. My mostly retired as well. My previous 10, 15 years did a lot of work on source water protection and worked in a couple communities in the valley, but mostly on the coast where source water and where it comes from is a bit limited and of course affected by climate change. I think my one experience with climate change is when DLCD came out about 10, 12 years ago with their coastal management program came out with a climate ready community kind of designation in our community and here in Neskowin, which for those of you who don't know is north of Lincoln City, about 10, 12 miles. We decided to take that on. And so over a 4-year period with a number of federal, state agencies and local people and help of the county, we came up with a coastal adaptation plan for Neskowin. It ended up resulting in the first ever land use ordinances that deal with coastal hazards caused by climate change. I think the county adopted those changes, and now actually the county is adopting some of those changes for the whole county as besides that. But so we have the only coastal hazard overlay zone in Neskowin, which is designed to protect people and property from the changes that are happening in the ocean. We learned a lot from a lot of the research on how climate change is affecting sea level rise, storms, ocean surges, wave heights, all kinds of things that in this process. So,
Great. Well, welcome, Guy and Bruce. So next we'll go Anne and then Herb.
Good morning. My name is Ann Hayden-Lesmeister. I'm an in-stream flow specialist in the water program with the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. So certainly professionally dealing with the impacts of climate change in pretty much every aspect of our program. And then more from a personal standpoint, I've been an avid backpacker in the Western United States for probably about 20 years now. And I would say that certainly within the last few years, it's become a part of my planning process much more than I ever thought about it in the past. Not only having a backup plan in case the original location of the trip is no longer a destination to go to at that time, as well as even planning trips themselves, knowing areas that have been recently burned to determine, whether they should be navigated at certain temperatures, because of the loss of shading and other factors like that. So.
Good morning, everybody. My name's Herb Winters. I'm the district manager for the Gillum SWCD. I'm fortunate enough to work on the same streams that I grew up fishing as a child, and have seen the change over my lifetime of steelhead streams going dry that have never been dry since I've been around. And so at least our shop, what we're trying to do is reintroduce beavers as fast as we can back into the landscape in the dry side over here in the lower John Day Basin.
Great. Thanks, Herb. And next we'll go Kristen and Alex.
Hi, everybody. Kristen Larson with the Lucky Mute Watershed Council. We're based in Independence in Polk County in the Mid-Willamette Valley. I've been at the Watershed Council for just over 10 years now. Much like you in the valley, the wildfire temperature, we had the heat dome last year. One of the more depressing things our monitoring coordinator said when she presented the 2021 data to us was cutting out or sort of clipping the heat dome data and presenting it as a potential surrogate, or sort of some of those peaks from last year, not just the heat dome effect, but the other heat waves that came through in 2021 that were so severe, as a surrogate for future conditions. And so that was hard to think about. We just got solar panels put on our house personally, so on a trying to help way. And we're also one of the partners in the Mid-Willamette Beaver Partnership. So I'll tag onto Herb's trying to help idea. Thanks.
Hi, everybody. My name is Alex Rice. I'm a project manager here at the North Fork John Day Watershed Council in sunny Long Creek. I have a background in climate change adaptation for forest management, and I'm just now starting to try and adapt that to watershed management and fish habitat restoration. So that's been pretty cool. I'd say the biggest climate change impact, I'm personally seeing out here is yes, we have wildfire. That's kind of always been part of the landscape out here. It's definitely getting worse, but the bigger thing is just the really extreme heat and drought. 2022 was a fairly wet and good year for us in terms of forage availability and just general quantity of water. That kind of dropped off in the second half of the year, but 2021 felt pretty apocalyptic in terms of we just didn't have a green up. There was no forage for anybody's livestock. Driving around the county, you just see a lot of ribs. And so I think we had something like 35 days over 100 degrees, which is it gets hot here, but that's pretty wild. And so it's affecting everything and everyone out here from wild to domestic livestock, and getting to the point where even the old ranchers aren't denying climate change anymore, which is pretty spectacular.
Great. Thanks, Alex. Kristen, next we'll go with Heather and Helena.
Hi, I'm Heather Hendrickson, District Manager at the Hood River SWCD, and I'm also on the Oregon Association of Conservation Districts Board. Let's see, so we rely on water here from the glaciers on Mount Hood and the mid-mountain snowpack, and the mid-mountain snowpack is getting more rain dominated and less snow. And then as the glaciers recede, they bring a lot of sediment down with them. And so a lot of our projects involve irrigation upgrades to these micro sprinklers, and that sediment poses a huge problem because they just clog, and it's just a big mess. And so looking towards the future, just what are we going to do with the water, and how can we maybe store it in other ways with the snowpack disappearing? And on a personal level, I like skiing on snow that's a little colder rather than wet. So.
We can't hear you, Helena. Why don't I'll move on and come back to you. How about that? Okay. Well, let's go Natasha and Dallas.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Natasha Billis. I'm the Conservation Director at Deschutes Land Trust. We're based in Bend. And I guess like others, the biggest thing I'm noticing in our area is drought and a dwindling groundwater supply. And the Deschutes is a heavily groundwater influenced river. And, just due to the drought, receding glaciers, we're experiencing less groundwater input into the system. So even in years where we're having normal snowpack, we're not seeing, normal stream flows. And like others, I like to ski. So the sort of in like dwindling snowpack is kind of an issue as well.
Hi, everybody. I'm Dallas Holder-Fries. I'm with Sustainable Northwest as their regenerative ranching program director. And as far as climate change, both personally on my own family's ranch and then the ranchers that we work with the drought and variable precipitation timing and quantities when it comes, just it's making it difficult for landowners to maintain kind of the forage that they had, let alone improve upon it. And so that's a big issue we're working through.
Great. Thanks, Dallas. Natasha, let's go next to Teresa and then Dirk, and then we'll try Helena again.
Hi, everyone. My name is Teresa, and I work around Green Spaces Institute. I'm also the co-leader of the Connecting Canopies Coalition. We're based out of the Portland Metro region. One thing that I feel like climate change has really impacted me, especially many of the fellow BIPOC and low-income community, is that extreme heat has really presented itself in a very challenging way to us. I still remember putting wet towels on my head just to keep myself cool. So that's a really big impact for a lot of people, especially for those who are not as mobile and not as financially stable to mitigate from the extreme heat. So that's one thing that I feel like is really prevalent, but not yet very widely aware by many community members. So yeah, thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dirk Renner with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Partners Program. I'm based in Bend. For me, climate change, one of the bigger impacts is just the fifth season we have now, smoke season, which usually starts sometime late July or in August, or sometimes goes to September. Used to be a great time of the year to do outdoor activities, and now you just never know because you might not want to be outside at all. Plus, it's having I think, if you don't have air conditioning, it's hard to cool your house off in the evening. You can't just open your windows up. So it's having extra climate impacts with people running AC. But thanks.
Great, thanks. Let's try again, Elena.
Can you hear me now?
Absolutely.
Okay, sorry about that. My name is Helena Linnell, and I'm the Biological Planning and Operations Manager for the Coquille Indian Tribe. We're located on the Southern Oregon coast. And I think some of the impacts that I experience as somebody who goes out and fishes, as well as hiking and nature, and part of my job as well is seeing the impacts that climate and warming water and air temperature can have on native plant and animal species, and how invasive or non-native species can really take hold and take advantage of those climatic conditions.
Thanks, Helena, and welcome. Okay, so next I will just share my screen here just to go over the agenda real quick. We have until noon today. I don't think we're going to take that much time, and we've built in several breaks within the morning as well. So we're right here at the role of the RAC and rulemaking context portion of the meeting. I'll provide a little bit of background on the RAC process, and then we'll turn it over to Jesse, who will give some additional background on the OWEB board climate resolution and really how we got to rulemaking from there. We'll take a break, and then we'll get into the discussion around the draft rule language that we sent out earlier. We don't have any public comments that is signed up for the day. We did receive the one public comment, which I forwarded to you on Friday. So what I think we'll do is we can discuss that along with the original draft of the rule language. And then we'll wrap up and talk about some next steps. And then, like I said, we'll get out of here by noon at the absolute latest. So any questions on the agenda? Okay. All right, so I'm going to give a little more background on the RAC process. And so to start with, what is an Oregon administrative rule? So this is the dry clinical definition. So it's an agency directive, standard, regulation, or statement of general applicability that implements, interprets, or prescribes law or policy, or that describes the procedure or practice of any agency. So what OWEB does with administrative rules is generally we interpret Oregon statute to describe the solicitation, review, funding decisions, and administration of OWEB's grant programs. So question we get is often is, do all of OWEB grant programs have separate administrative rules? And the answer is almost. We have administrative rules for OWEB's restoration grants, technical assistance, stakeholder engagement, monitoring, our FIP program, and then water acquisitions and land acquisitions. We do have some other grant types. I'm thinking in particular around drought and fire that are wildfire recovery that are new programs. And so those grant programs that don't have specific administrative rules, they are administered through the broad OWEB grant program rules. And I also want to mention, I'll put a pin on this now, but we have the OWEB administrative rules. And as Bruce knows quite well, we have administrative rules for the Oregon Agricultural Heritage Program, which we'll discuss a little bit later. So how does OWEB make administrative rules? So first, we start with the OWEB board initiating rulemaking. If there are existing rules that we would like to have amended, or if there are new rules that are to be developed. And once the board initiates rulemaking, staff form a rulemaking advisory committee and start working on some draft language to bring to the RAC. We'll sometimes have one, two, several meetings before we're able to kind of really fine tune that language and bring back to the OWEB board for approval after another public process involving public comment and a verbal or oral public comment period. So the RAC, so you all serve as an advisory body to OWEB with the role of providing advice and framing policy choices for the agency. So, ultimately OWEB retains the rulemaking authority. So while we do retain the rulemaking authority, we really strive to achieve consensus in this process with all members of the RAC in a way that hopefully seeks to understand the interests of everyone here, and we'll work together to provide or work to find any workable solutions if there's any disagreements. I think it's also important to point out that statute also requires us to seek the RAC's recommendations on whether any rule changes will have a fiscal impact and what the extent of that impact will be, and whether the rule will have any significant adverse impact on small businesses. So this RAC, as we've heard as we went around for introductions, is comprised of individuals that represent the interests of persons most likely to be impacted by the rules. And in this case, that would be applicants to OEB's grant programs, grant reviewers, agency partners, and grantees. And we've really done our best to get representatives from across the state, from different sized organizations, and focus on the work that you do. So with that, we really hope to have a rich discussion today, and really encourage and value your input from where you sit. So with that, I will turn it over to Jesse to provide some more input or background on the climate resolution, how we got to today.
Thanks, Eric. Okay, so this presentation I'm going to give is going to be similar to one that we gave to our board in July. So if you listened in on that board meeting or watched any of the recordings, you'll see some familiar information. But as Eric mentioned, I just want to talk a little bit about the climate resolution and the public engagement process that we went through after adoption of that resolution, and then some of the findings that we feel like will inform the rulemaking discussions that we'll have here today. So hopefully you've at least had an opportunity to look at the climate resolution, but if you haven't, I just want to spend a little bit of time going through what it says. So the board adopted this resolution in January of 2022, and there's a series of background statements, but it states that OEB will integrate climate mitigation and adaptation in our budgeting, investing, and policymaking decisions by funding climate smart adaptation and resilience for Oregon's watersheds, natural resources, people, and communities, funding projects that include meaningful emissions reductions, carbon sequestration, and protection of carbon storage, and valuing project co-benefits and assessing long-term sustainability of our projects and acquisitions. The resolution also states that we will learn and apply diversity, equity, inclusion, and environmental justice principles when making our funding decisions to address challenges arising from climate change to traditionally underrepresented and impacted communities, and that we'll engage these communities in our processes to craft meaningful solutions that are then integrated into our funding decisions. So following adoption of that resolution, we heard from a number of our different partners and people that we work with that they would really appreciate if we undertook a public engagement process just to get some feedback from folks about how this is going to potentially affect their ability to apply for OEB grant programs, and just get some input. What are some of the challenges and opportunities that might come up as a result of this resolution? So our goals for the process were first just to provide our partners and potential grant applicants and grantees with an overview of the climate resolution, and then really to learn from them about the potential challenges and opportunities that they see associated with implementing it. And then the goal is to use that feedback to inform considerations around rulemaking. So we tried to have a number of different opportunities for engagement. We held 6 virtual public listening sessions. These were held at different times of the day and different days of the week. We held a tribal focus group listening session, which was also virtual. We had an online survey that was open for a couple of months. We offered one-on-one conversations with OEB staff, with myself and Eric Hartstein. And then we were working with a consultant who conducted some interviews with non-traditional partners to get input from them as to how the resolution was likely to affect their ability to apply for OEB grants. So for the public and tribal listening sessions, this is what we focused on. We asked for participants to talk a little bit about the challenges and opportunities related to integrating emissions reductions, carbon sequestration and storage, and adaptation and resilience into projects. What kinds of resources, support, and technical assistance would they need in order to do that successfully? And then other feedback and input as they were willing to share it. The survey generally covered the same content as the listening sessions. It was meant really to offer an alternative avenue for folks to share their concerns, the opportunities that they saw, or to provide general feedback. And it did consist of some additional content that we weren't able to cover in the time allotted in the listening session. So there were some more specific questions related, for example, to the diversity, equity, and inclusion and environmental justice bullet points of our climate resolution. So for the public listening sessions, these were held in April and May of last year. We had 77 unique participants that attended, and many of those attended more than one session. What you can see is that we had participants representing all 6 of OWEB's regions across the state, with the most representing or coming from the Willamette Basin or Region 3, and the fewest coming from the Mid-Columbia region. Participants primarily represented soil and water conservation districts and watershed councils, as well as nonprofit organizations, although we did have participants from federal and state agencies, tribes, local government, and then a number of private businesses or for-profit organizations attended as well. What you can see is that the vast majority of folks identified their role as either an executive director or coordinator or a project and program manager. For the tribal focus group listening session, we invited all 9 of Oregon's federally recognized tribes. We also invited the Nez Perce tribe to attend. We had representatives from 8 of those 10 tribes that were in attendance, and in almost all cases, I think we had multiple representatives from each tribe that attended. We received 44 different survey responses. Many of those, I'd say many of those were also from folks that attended the listening session, so it was just another way for them to articulate their concerns or the opportunities that they saw. We had 3 one-on-one conversations, and then there were 14 different interviews that were conducted with those non-traditional partners to get their input as well. So now what I'm going to do is just spend a bit of time talking about some of the key findings from that public engagement process and how it relates to the discussions that we're going to be having here today. Before I do that, I wanted to mention that throughout this whole public engagement process, we wanted to highlight that participants did a really excellent job of trying to balance any kinds of concerns or challenges that they saw arising from this climate resolution with the opportunities and appreciation that this is a really important issue that we need to be addressing, and understanding that climate and integrating climate impacts and adaptation and mitigation is really an important step forward. And so what we've done here is just organize the findings into 2 sort of broad bins. One is around rulemaking considerations, and then the second bin is just around other considerations, things to keep in mind for OWEB. But I do also think you'll see they will have some relevance to our discussion here today. So first, I'll just start with one of the big themes that we heard was just the importance of developing broad evaluation criteria, which really comes into play here, and what you'll see reflected in the draft criteria that we shared with you. That participants really expressed the need to have more flexibility in terms of what kinds of improvements and enhancements are helpful in order to allow for a diversity of ways to achieve the climate mitigation and adaptation benefits. So they're really hoping that the criteria that get developed are broad, because that gives people a lot of opportunities and flexibilities for what will fit within those when they're responding to those criteria in their grant applications, for example. The second is just the importance of maximizing all project benefits. So how do we find a balance between helping our projects optimize those mitigation and adaptation impacts and benefits without detracting from the ecological project benefits that OWEB has always prioritized and funded? So what criteria are going to help to maximize those natural resource, human community, and climate benefits while also minimizing the burden on our grant applicants? The next theme that we heard a lot was just the importance or the desire to start qualitative and move to quantitative. There's a lot of challenges associated with quantifying emissions reductions, carbon sequestration and storage, and adaptation and resilience benefits. The available tools, data, and process are really going to vary by habitat type, by project type, and it makes that really difficult to standardize and then compare across projects. And then also most applicants do not necessarily have the current capacity or expertise to do that kind of quantitative analysis, even know where to look for the data and the tools in order to do that. And so qualitative descriptions of these kinds of mitigation and adaptation benefits may be a more appropriate first step, with that quantitative piece coming later as some of that science and data and tools evolve. Oops, excuse me. The next is to consider the trade-offs that are associated with mitigation-based criteria. So just having the recognition that some different project activities, for example, something like prescribed burning, will of course release carbon in the short term, but hopefully by doing that activity, it's going to prevent an even larger release of carbon in the long term, for example, by preventing catastrophic wildfire. So just considering those kinds of trade-offs, and then also understanding that the ability to sequester and store carbon is going to vary by property or geographic area and location and habitat type. So for example, meadow or floodplain restoration projects, their carbon sequestration ability isn't going to necessarily be the same as west side forests, for example, or even compared to grassland and shrubland habitats. And so thinking about, how we balance or just consider those trade-offs, particularly around mitigation-based criteria and carbon sequestration and storage. And then being clear about the definitions and expectations of applicants. You'll see in the draft rule language that we sent, there's a section for definitions. Really being clear about what our definitions are and being able to build that shared understanding so that our applicants know what it is we're asking of them, and understand what those definitions mean and what will be considered good or appropriate answers or responses to those kinds of evaluation criteria. And the next is really just an opportunity that applicants, or I'm sorry, that our partners in the public engagement process highlighted, was just that adding these kinds of climate evaluation criteria into our rules gives us an opportunity to really think about and re-examine current practices and how we can modify our projects to better address climate impacts, become more efficient, or revise priorities. So just understanding that, thinking more how we look at our project longevity and how we can modify our design and implementation of our projects to better maximize some of these climate benefits and to be more resilient in the long term. The next is that, and this kind of goes along with that, developing broad evaluation criteria, just that flexibility is key because a lot of this information and science is, and the practices are evolving and changing rapidly. It's just going to be important for us to build some flexibility into our language, and then also go back and as we learn information from our partners that are implementing this kind of stuff on the ground, how do we then revisit, revise, and update our rules based on that information? The eighth one is to put traditionally underrepresented and impacted communities at the table with decision-making power. This is pretty straightforward. Just it's important that we do that and find opportunities and ways to do that. And then the ninth is to develop and apply a predetermined equity lens. This was just another consideration that was highlighted, because this kind of equity lens can help to prioritize funding to community members who are being impacted first and most significantly by climate change. And one of the things that we heard from partners during that process was just potentially thinking about ecosystem services for those communities, how those might be lost, and then how they can be replaced or enhanced. So now I'm going to move into some of the broader concerns and opportunities that arose as part of this public engagement process. The first is just really related to carbon greenhouse gas emissions reductions. And one of the things that we heard highlighted time and again by our partners is just restoration equipment transitions will be challenging. So as we think about, adding criteria aimed at reducing greenhouse gas emissions, recognizing that requiring things like restoration equipment transitions is really not going to be realistic for a lot of places in the state. Electric options for heavy equipment are maybe non-existent or really limited and expensive. And then statewide, there's still currently a lack of infrastructure and equipment to really support charging electric equipment and all of that. And so when we think about ways to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, just recognizing that any kinds of restoration equipment transitions are really challenging at this point in time. The other broader concern that was identified was just applicant capacity varies. So these asking people to respond to climate evaluation criteria requires potentially new skills or new information. It's going to need guidance and trainings and classes and tools to help our applicants respond effectively. So it's just important to recognize that capacity is really going to vary. The next is to be aware of unintended consequences. So in some cases, there may be, for example, culturally significant plants that could fall under a place where it's been set aside for carbon sequestration, which maybe would prevent access, for example. So just trying to be aware of where we might see unintended consequences as we develop criteria. The next is that emissions reductions opportunities may be possible. So while restoration equipment transitions will be challenging, there's a lot of other ways that we can find opportunities to reduce emissions. So things like carpooling, utilizing virtual meetings, localizing work or coordinating with other grantees when you have need to haul materials. So there's a lot of other opportunities and ways that we can reduce emissions that don't necessarily rely on things like equipment transitions. An opportunity that came up was just that this may be a new opportunity for our grant applicants and partners to attract new climate-centric funders, or it could set them up to apply for new funding opportunities. For example, some of the federal money that is coming out with the Inflation Reduction Act or the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. And that also best practices, case studies, and demonstration projects are effective tools to help applicants. So the more kinds of examples that we can develop for climate smart practices and management measures, including those that do or do not work in different regions, would be incredibly helpful to our applicants. And then lastly is just the importance of investing time in developing long-term relationships. So OWEB, something for us to keep in mind is just that we will, it would be beneficial for us to have that staff capacity to build relationships and trust and shared purpose for engaging over the long term. And so with that, I can take any questions about the public engagement process or any of the findings that came up, but just wanted to put this out there as some of the things to keep in mind as we're going into that discussion around the draft rules. And stop there.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Jesse. And I think I neglected also to pause after my presentation, see if there's any questions on the overall role of the RAC and or the rulemaking process. So any questions for either Jesse or myself? Okay, not seeing any.
I have one. Sorry, it's Kristen. Can you guys talk about, or maybe this will come up later in terms of the process? So, you know, you said for most of OWEB's grant programs have their own set of rules as well, but not all. So we're here for the Division 5 sort of umbrella rules related to the climate change criteria. For the other grant programs that have their own set of rules, what's the interplay between their rules and the climate change criteria that will come into play? Or are there future RACs coming for like the restoration grant program and the TA grant program and the SE program, or is this it for now? Does that make sense?
It does, Kristen. Thanks for the question. And you're kind of stealing my thunder a little bit here. But that's good because you know, what the board authorized in July was for the climate resolution to be implemented through evaluation criteria across all of OWEB's grant programs. So we could have done that a couple different ways. We could have gone into each division, administrative rule division, and established evaluation criteria. So for stakeholder engagement grants, have evaluation criteria related to climate for stakeholder engagement, technical assistance, monitoring, et cetera. Kind of go down the line and establish criteria that way. The way we're proposing to do this now is kind of related to the key findings that Jesse just talked about keeping it broad to start with, is that we include it in our Division 5, or kind of the OWEB grant program umbrella rules, which have all the other grant program rules kind of sit under. And we develop criteria that would then apply to each of those different grant types at this point. And we're also thinking that, at least for a starting point, that we would have this kind of Division 5 umbrella rule approach also apply in the Oregon Agricultural Heritage Program rules, because that rule set has its own Division 5 of kind of the broad grant program rules. So that's how we are proposing to at least start this process. Does that help?
I had one more question. That's okay. So thank you for the presentation, going through all the listening session feedback and survey, and that was really helpful. The other piece was OWEB had included the sort of information gathering climate related questions on grant applications in the last year that weren't part of evaluation, but were to help understand where grant applicants are at. I can't remember, is there a staff report on that, or are we going to talk about information from that? Is that not really relevant to this process? What came from those examples? So I don't remember ever seeing feedback from that since then.
There was feedback on it during a climate and water committee meeting, but it would have been last spring. And I can look back and see if I can find it. I would have given a presentation. It would have, I don't know if it's recorded. I can't remember if we did start recording those then. But what I can tell you, so the questions, for those of you that aren't familiar with what Kristen is talking about, in our last year of any open grant applications that we had, we asked a series of questions around climate. So we asked, for example, how have you integrated climate impacts in, or like, what's your understanding of climate changes and impacts for your projects or your geography or your region? Then how have you incorporated those impacts into your project planning or design? And then are you thinking about any ways to reduce greenhouse gas emissions reductions? And there was a different check boxes of like, I'm going to be using like electric equipment, or I can't remember all the different options, but there is a whole bunch of check boxes. And then there was again a series of check boxes for adaptation and resilience types of benefits. So it was like, I'm helping to reduce, my project activities are going to help to reduce stream temperatures, or I am, improving, let's see, I can't remember what they all are, but it's things like maybe improving fish passage or things like that. So what we did, OWEB staff looked at the different responses to try to get a sense of where applicants were at in their understanding of these different climate impacts and how they've incorporated them. And what we found is that people generally have a good understanding of what kinds of climate changes and impacts are a concern for their project, for their region, what they're really worried about. When it came to applicants articulating how they've integrated those impacts into their project design, it was more variable. I would say that people were really good about identifying how their project was likely to confer some kinds of adaptation or mitigation benefits. So for example, we're doing, riparian plantings is going to help with providing shading for streams. people had that particular piece of it, could understand that. Maybe much better at articulating the adaptation and resilience, maybe less so on the carbon sequestration and storage, although we didn't necessarily ask for people to respond to that. I will say that there was maybe less, what was less clear in applicant responses was how people have maybe modified their project design to incorporate climate changes and impacts. So for example, if you're likely to see increased flooding, you'll see, like, for example, people say we're going to do larger culverts. We're going to, change the culvert to withstand X, flood event year. But you wouldn't always see that. In some cases, people would jump straight to the benefits without saying, actually, it's becoming hotter and drier. We're seeing a 5th season of wildfire smoke, like whatever. And so because of that, like, we have decided we need to move all of our plantings that we were previously going to do in August. Now we have to do in October, because so just kind of small things like that, or we're changing the species mix that we're doing in order to try to pick some species from, the southern edge of their limit and trying them here, or, those kinds of things weren't as well articulated in the responses. So I think that's probably an area where there's maybe less understanding of how you might explicitly integrating those things. There's maybe just some work on our part that needs to be done as to what we're looking for there if we ask that kind of a question.
Great. Thanks, Kristen, for those questions. Are there any others before we take a bit of a break?
Before we take a break, Eric, I thought of one more thing, because we also asked that question in our monitoring applications. And I would say, and the other thing, I think that we didn't ask it in the regular, like, open solicitation restoration one, but when we think about it in terms of monitoring, again, really good at thinking about monitoring climate changes and impacts, thinking about what we monitor for effectiveness. How effective are our actions at addressing climate vulnerabilities or reducing climate impacts? So that's another place where we are maybe seeing, where we would need to, like, think a little bit more about how to ask that, or what we would ask of people there when it comes to monitoring.
Yeah, thanks, Jesse. Okay, so looks like we might be ready for a break. So let's take 15 minutes and be back at 12 after.
Eric, do you want me to share my screen now, or you want to wait till everybody's back?
Why don't we just wait another minute or so? Okay, so I see mostly faces now. So I think we're probably ready to hop back into this. So next up, we have a conversation, discussion around the draft language that OEB staff have developed for the climate-related evaluation criteria. So Jessie has kindly volunteered to share her screen on the draft language, and we could kind of talk through this. To begin with, so as we noted before the break, we're looking to do this in our Division 5 or OEB grant program rules, which would keep it broad and applicable to the other grant programs based on the language that we have here in the introductory statement. I will note that we did receive in the public comment from Megan Kemple with the Oregon Climate and Agriculture Network some proposed edits, as she noted in the intro statement to include the Oregon Agricultural Heritage Program. So I think what we would do there is that if there is the potential to basically mirror these rules for the Oregon Ag Heritage Program Division 5, because those rules are actually separate than this rule set. We have, I think it's maybe somewhat uncommon, but we have kind of two different chapters for OEB, one for the OEB rules and the other for the Oregon Ag Heritage rules. So what we're hoping is to basically mirror this from the OEB rules over to the OAHP, Oregon Ag Heritage Program rules. And then the other comment that Megan had would be to include language for the grant programs listed in this section following grant applications in the second to last line of that intro there. And I don't think you need to make those edits right now, Jesse. You just want to kind of raise them. And so then following that intro statement, we have what are the draft evaluation criteria, which would be applicable, as noted, to all of OEB grant programs listed above. So one would be how the applicant seeks to engage communities impacted by climate change. And I would note here that we thought that if we are going to include this criterion, that we should include a definition of communities impacted by climate change. The second criterion is how changing climate conditions are incorporated into the project design and implementation. Third is how the applicant seeks to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in project implementation. And again, we thought it'd be helpful to have a definition around reduced greenhouse gas emissions. The fourth criterion is how project outcomes could result in the sequestration or storage of carbon and/or enhanced adaptation and resilience for natural resources and/or communities. And the public comments suggested that this was actually separated out into two separate criterion, one with the sequestration or carbon, and the next for adaptation and resilience. So I'll stop there and see if there are questions, comments, suggested edits to the draft.
Eric?
Yes.
Eric, this is Guy Siebert. And I may be the only one that kind of had this kind of reaction as I read the kind of opening paragraph. When we say that grant applications shall also be evaluated on the extent to which the application describes. So we're not saying to the extent in which the application addresses any of these successfully or not successfully or whatever. But it just kind of struck me as I read through this that if I were applying for a grant, I could describe how our application quite thoroughly either addresses these four conditions or not. But as long as what I write to the extent of, it's the extent of my writing describing that is what the criteria is. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so, guys. So would a potential edit here be changing describes to addresses?
Yes. Because we're not rewarding the description.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an excellent point. Thanks. And I think I saw Teresa, then Alex, then Helena.
Hi, yeah. So I do have one about the term communities impacted by climate change, because everyone is impacted by climate change. So I feel like using communities in general is very broad, and it doesn't really serve as like a focused approach. So I would suggest using other words such as communities I always have a problem saying that word, disproportionately impacted by climate change, or climate frontline communities. Of course, climate frontline requires another set of definitions, but that is a more targeted, or focused way of describing who we really are trying to serve. I also think the fourth point there, how project outcomes could result in the sequestration or storage of carbon and or enhance. I do have like the same comment with the communities, where I feel like the sequestration or storage of carbon and or enhanced the sequestration or storage of carbon part should be separated into one, and then the enhanced adaptation and resilience for communities should be another one.
Great. Yeah. Thanks, Teresa. So I think Jesse's making those changes, and I think those look pretty reasonable. Yeah, can't see everyone. Were you going to say something else there, Teresa?
Yeah, and I just have one thing I forgot to mention. This came up as a challenge in a grants that a nonprofit I serve on as well is when grants ask about reduced greenhouse gas emissions, smaller nonprofits have a really big challenge on even just describing how their work reduces greenhouse gases. We don't have any capacity or measures, by we I mean smaller nonprofits, to make that calculation. So if we're just if we're just describing, it sort of makes smaller nonprofits lose that competition compared to bigger nonprofits who have the capacity to make that calculation. So I think that should be embedded in the languages that, you know, by describing to what extent of descriptions are you looking for, and how will that impact smaller nonprofits' ability to acquire grants like this? Because a lot of them are doing great underground work. It's just that when you're evaluating based on these calculations, it automatically takes them out of the applicant pool.
Great. Yeah, and thank you for saying that, Teresa. And that's, we heard that, I think, loud and clear as well during the public engagement process. And that's why we wanted to have a definition around the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. The way that we are looking at that now is, for example, if an application in a restoration project is, they're looking to put large wood in a stream. And there's a couple of options that the applicant can utilize to do so. One, they could use a helicopter, or they could use a local contractor, with ground-based equipment to tip over trees into the stream. A discussion in the application about, we chose the, to use ground-based equipment, for a variety of reasons, probably, but also because we think it will have fewer greenhouse gas emissions to implement. Now, maybe those trees that they're looking to place in the stream are a half mile up the hill slope, and there's really no way to get them from that landing up there into the stream. And so a discussion about, we needed to use a helicopter to do it this way. We understand that this will likely result in additional greenhouse gas emissions than would be if there was ground-based equipment, but this is our reasoning why. So really just providing their explanation in the grant application itself. So I see a lot of hands. I think it was Alex, Helena, then Bruce.
Yes, and honestly, Teresa covered a lot of what I was going to say, so thank you, Teresa. I think I do want to glom onto that concept a little bit. I know you've responded to it, but yeah, in addition to the sort of small nonprofits, the undue burden on small nonprofits, which we are also a small nonprofit, but we also have an operating area roughly the size of Rhode Island. And so there's big trade-offs in attempting to reduce emissions. We're basically, the trade-off there is doing things by hand versus doing things by machine. And if we do things by hand, the operating or the time to complete those tasks is significantly increased, and any emissions reductions we save there are made up for by increased driving time for having to repeatedly enter the site or what have you. And then I also think of other watershed councils on this side of the state that have even bigger operating areas than we do. And so there is and I think there's probably a theme across several of these criteria and where it's going to impact West Side organizations differently than it's going to impact East Side organizations just by right of the size of some of these watersheds and some of these operating areas. And so consideration for that would be good. And then something that's just occurred to me as this discussion was ongoing was specifically like 1 and 5 talking about resilience and addressing climate impacts on communities or communities that are disproportionately impacted. We're definitely disproportionately impacted here, but there's another limiting factor here, which is acceptance of the fact that these things are even going on. A lot of these adaptation measures can be quite unpopular here. I'm thinking about like prescribed burning to reduce fuels in fire-prone ponderosa pine forests. The fire boss out here was just arrested related to a prescribed burn. And so I wonder if some, and I'm flexible on this, but some language to drive not just putting these measures into place, but trying to drive education and acceptance of the existence of climate change or of the existence of these impacts, and acceptance of the need for new measures, because that is new techniques here can be pretty unpopular, and we tend to get a lot of pushback, and that's a big part of our battle out here is just the outreach component.
Yeah, thanks for that, Alex. Hear you loud and clear on that. And yeah, in addition to what Jesse's putting up on the screen, I know April's taking some good notes as well. So I think that's really important input. Let's go Helena, Bruce, then Kristen.
Thanks. Yeah, I agree with the comments and edits made before as well. So I had a couple things and maybe all of these items giving examples of what that would mean in an application, depending on which grant category this is being applied to, giving some examples as you've described in the earlier part of our conversations. And then also thinking about how are these projects going to be ranked on these 6 categories? How is the ranking from 1 to 2 or points or however it ends up working out based on applicants' description of how their project is going to change climate conditions? Are they incorporated into project design and implementation, for example? So what does that ranking criteria, evaluation criteria look like? And then thinking about what Alex said a little bit more about rural versus more urban areas. Our state relatively is rural. And so our access to, more climate friendly equipment and techniques and infrastructure, we know is limited. And so how can we encourage that to expand to our state as a whole and to our more rural communities so that there isn't that disproportionate application of effects to more rural places within our state.
Yeah, thanks, Elena, for that. I think excellent feedback. On your first point around examples, the way we typically develop our rules is to keep things rather broad in the rule language, as to not kind of either tie our applicants or grantees or us into a certain direction, or kind of back us into a corner, particularly when it's kind of new rules. and we don't know exactly how it's going to play out on the ground. So what we like to do is keep things broad, and then with guidance during each application type, write in those examples so that applicants are clear as to what is being asked for in their applications and how those will be reviewed. I think we could definitely consider including examples in the definitions here, but I also want to just make sure folks know that guidance for our grant applications and grant types is something that we take pretty seriously, and we'll use the rules to kind of really drive that guidance.
Yeah, that makes sense, Eric. I think I think a lot of looking at like technical assistance or restoration grants or even monitoring grants to some degree. I think a lot of that language and work about incorporating climate change into design and the project itself, I think it's already there, but like pulling out specifically for applicants, pulling out, okay, if you're doing this already, but let's shift that frame just a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that and this kind of gets at your second question, Helena, which is around kind of how would these evaluation criteria kind of fit into existing criteria. We don't weight criteria in the reviews of the grant application. So these would be in addition to the existing criteria. And it's really just a climate lens that would be applied to the project. So in addition to all the other considerations that applicants are thinking about when developing an application or a project, applying that climate lens as well. And we know that many applicants already do that. And this would be just a way to help get those thoughts on the paper. And if folks aren't doing it, that it would hopefully get them thinking about it as they're developing their projects and applications. Bruce, and then Kristen, then Dallas.
Thanks, Eric. I have a couple of things that come to mind. The first one, building a little bit on what Guy was saying, there's kind of technical nitpicky language stuff, but the way that opening paragraph is framed just before the colon is that we are evaluating them on how the application is written. And I think what we're really trying to get is just not how well did you write this, but what is the actual impact of the proposal, the proposed action, because you could do a great job describing this, but you may have a smaller, insignificant, or not very important effect on climate change adaptation, emissions reduction, all those kind of things. So I think that's just a kind of a grammar construction issue that I'll let you figure out.
Thanks, Bruce.
And the second one was, and I know you said, you don't really have weighting in the criteria here, but the more I think about it, at least for me personally, the emissions reduction stuff in this context is very much secondary to the other criteria. I think for a whole lot of reasons, not least of which is it's really hard to quantify. But the scale at which most OWEB funded projects are doing things, the emissions reductions, I think, are probably mitigation side is a lot less important than the adaptation and resilience side there. And the third point that came to my mind was, because I'm supposed to be here to think about this through the perspective of the Oregon Agricultural Heritage Program. And a lot of these things are really much more directed towards like restoration grants. These kind of criteria don't address as well the kind of things that you get either through land acquisition or land conservation, which is often avoided losses or avoided impacts, which are often difficult to quantify. Even if you can quantify, there's sort of the probability part of how likely and over what time scale would these impacts be avoided. So just something to think about in terms of the applicability for conservation easements, land acquisition, things like that. I think it works much better for more of that dirt moving on the ground, do things, restoration grants probably.
Yeah, thanks, Bruce. I mean, do you see, with that OAHP hat on, do you see, maybe like the current 4 or 5 lending themselves to criteria in that program?
I think I do. It's these are things though that are more challenging to quantify in some ways or to project in terms of avoided losses and avoided impacts. In most cases, the land conservation, we're really looking at things that are already doing good things, and we're trying to keep them that way, and trying to quantify avoided losses and avoided impacts is a little bit more challenging. But here again, I don't know that it's a numerical thing in this case. What we're asking people to do is persuade us that this is really important.
Yeah, thanks, Bruce. I think you're right on that latter.
And I will say one more thing, in the Agricultural Heritage Program, when we wrote those rules at great length over many weeks, months, it seemed like, oftentimes there was always a tension between wanting evaluation criteria that gave people a very clear, you get this many points for that number of, where you score on the scale. And the Agricultural Heritage Commission ended up falling on the side of more, we're going to tell you what kind of outcomes we're looking for, and then leave it to the applicant to, make the case that their project is really good in doing those things. It's a lot harder to construct a system that allows people to put things neatly into boxes and score points that way. It's a little bit harder to judge, but on the more qualitative side, but that's where the Agricultural Heritage Program rules went.
Excellent. Yeah, thanks, Bruce. Kristen, go ahead.
Okay, thanks. Couple things and building off prior comments and some other comments. So when you, the in addition to, I guess, these criteria being in addition to, so I'm picturing all the bubble diagrams in my head of, we deal mostly with restoration, TA, stakeholder engagement, and monitoring. So these would end up being sort of another bubble, maybe instead of things that would go into that. Is that a correct way to think about it from an applicant perspective?
Yeah, I think so. It would be,
okay.
It would be, yeah, a bigger bubble diagram, if you will.
Oh, okay. And following up on Bruce's comment in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, I think in terms of at least from our experience, the difficulties in achieving some of that from the limited options for contractors, yes, carpooling, yes, potentially Zoom, but also in-person stakeholder engagement is super important, and there's trade-offs to building that trust and having those relationships versus doing it over Zoom to save some emissions. And does it warrant the same level of criteria if we're going qualitative versus quantitative and not able to calculate and measure those reductions? Would that be something that would fall, there's already the question on, at least I'm looking at the restoration application, how do you minimize adverse impacts in implementation? If it's herbicide use or erosion or whatever, greenhouse gas emissions fall into all of those impacts we're having when we implement. So maybe something to think about is we're already talking about how to reduce our impacts when we implement from other pieces, at least from a restoration perspective. Is there a way to incorporate that outside of criteria? And then I think lastly, related to the engaging communities, and I really appreciate Teresa's comment on, you know, the world is impacted by climate change, so being clear about what we're talking about there. I think this is really important, but I think it's tricky. And for me, there's a tension in setting up a system where people are trying to tick a box and say, yeah, I reached out to folks, or coming to communities in a way with not in true engagement. And what we're learning is, you know, in trying to think about, you don't come when an idea is fully formed or mostly formed and say, here's what we're going to do. We want you to get on board. But you're engaging in a way that I want to hear what your priorities are, what your concerns are, how can we work on this together, if that makes sense, that kind of thing, really from the front end, not, hey, we want to do large wood and I've come here to engage with you because I have to for this application. And I wonder about the unintended consequences of setting that up. I don't know that people would do that, but I just, you know, with and I've gotten on the soapbox with the OA board already in other meetings, but the, you know, the idea of coming open to engagement and open to what the outcome is without a predetermined income is a really important part of engaging communities who have not historically had a voice. And that's a separate process and difficult to fund with OEB dollars. And so coming at it when you're putting out these applications and proposals and really trying to say, yeah, we're going to acquire this land or we're going to implement this monitoring, and just being careful about how that's proposed and not setting up unintended consequences where people are just coming, you know, kind of, I'm letting you know about this idea, I guess, and how to manage that.
Yeah, that's really valuable input, I think, Kristen. Thank you. Let's go with Dallas.
Yeah. Thanks everybody for all the comments. I think they've all been really good. One thing that I was just thinking about is for criteria number 4, resulting in sequestration of, or storage of carbon, I think it would be important to add long-term in there. I keep thinking about juniper removal, which in the short term actually emits a lot of carbon, but there's a lot of long-term, you know, benefits to it, which kind of segues to, I'm going to push back on splitting out 4 and 5 a little bit, or maybe reworking it. I feel that a lot of times a lot of focus is put on carbon sequestration, which is great, especially when we're talking about, you know, climate impacts. But what I don't want to get lost is the importance of other ecosystem services, especially water, in these projects. You know, recharging water supplies and stuff can also have incredible impacts on the ecosystems and the ability to be resilient to climate. And so I think it actually made sense to me to have carbon sequestration and or some other enhancement of natural resources that provide resilience to the ecosystem as a whole in the face of climate change. But communities, I think, could be added. Somehow that language could be added to number 1. I think as we're building these out, just wordsmithing and consolidating these into as few like really pointed criteria is the best way to do it, instead of drawing them out into, oh my gosh, now this applicant has to answer like 6 more questions after they've already answered all of the other questions on the application. So anyways, those are just a few comments, and I'm open. We can split it up, but that's just my thought process there.
Yeah, thanks, Dallas. I hear what you're saying there on the potential to lump kind of 4 and 5. So yeah, I think that's one we'll probably get back to here as we kind of move forward with the language here. I saw Guy, then Dirk, and then I'm going to go with Heather, then Teresa. Thank you all for being patient.
This is Guy. I was thinking of, and I can't remember who talked about the working in a community where there is a lot of resistance to the notion of climate change. And I was, and I don't have any specific edits in mind here, but just because there might be a couple of different places if people think about this and the way I'm going to describe it, we might be able to make some changes. But, you know, climate has been changing for roughly 150 years. And the one thing that nobody can deny within any region is what the current situation is, and that it's probably different than what they remember in the past or whatever. And, you know, some projects may just deal with the changes that have already occurred to the natural resource that they've been dependent on, or to, you know, whatever. And so you know, when I think of, let's say, for instance, the adaptation definition, in some ways, you know, it's not always looking forward to what may be happening in the future, and who knows, because there are multiple futures out there. But what has already happened in the past, that is something certain. So if I come to OWEB with a project that is dealing with changes that have already occurred, and it's an easy sell for whoever I'm talking. I mean, you know, they can't deny the changes that have already occurred, and we want to do some adaptation to kind of catch up to the current. You kind of don't want that discriminated against either. And, you know, it eliminates the argument about, well, who knows what's going to happen in 50 or 100 years or 200 years. You know, no one knows. You know, somebody's going to put a large carbon rod up into the sky and collect carbon out of our atmosphere or something. I don't know. But so I just, in general, want to make sure that we're not thinking of climate change as something that may happen or that's coming, but something that's already happened, and projects may want to address those as well.
Yeah, thanks, Guy. And I think you're absolutely right, and that's you know, something we'll definitely need to keep in mind throughout these the establishment of these criteria. So go ahead, Dirk.
I think, yeah, great conversation, and you know, it made me think about some of these questions a little bit differently than I had been. One of the thoughts, I like the thought on number one, modifying that. And something I'd like to add to that would be maybe the local communities, because I wouldn't want to see like the, you know, John Day Basin needing to address the disproportionately affected community on the coast dealing with sea level rise. So it's something that I think it needs to focus in on, you know, engaging and addressing the challenges that are facing the local communities, just to kind of like focus that question in a little bit more. And then I had a thought on, I actually thought, you know, I know you guys mentioned maybe combining, was it 4 and 5? I thought about maybe combining 2 and let's see, 2 and 5. And one of the thoughts was how, you know, maybe refining the question to say something like, how is the project design and implementation resilient to changing climate conditions? Because we don't really know, you know, we've got changing climate conditions, but it's hard to kind of define exactly what, you know, what the change is going to be in the future. You know, as Guy was saying, we know what's happened currently, we know what's happened in the past, but we don't necessarily, you know, we don't have that crystal ball where we know, oh, well, this is exactly what's going to happen in the future. So to me, it's, you know, addressing changing conditions is about incorporating that resiliency, which is highlighted in question 5. So I thought we might be able to combine those two. And then I've maybe it's just me and maybe I don't have enough knowledge on the topic. And the long-term sequestration and storage of carbon, I don't know how we calculate that. I think there's multiple different ways to calculate that, but if you're looking at a project in whole and all the aspects of it, is there something that, a lot of the, is there a defined protocol that is known that people can use to go through and like, all right, this is my project, and you put the numbers in and or is it more of like, well, kind of a guess? To me right now, there's a lot of different science and little different methodologies out there, and it's not really well enough defined. I don't think the science is quite there, but then again, there might be knowledge that I don't have. So those are my main comments at this point.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks, Dirk. And I think we're right there with you on the sequestration, storage of carbon comment on the availability of a really good calculator or something that applicants could just plug something in and would spit out what their plans are, what the estimated sequestration or carbon results of their project might be. So we're definitely in the qualitative, as we've discussed, part of the process. So Heather, go ahead.
I like the conversation so far too, and I think what I'm thinking is, I think similar to what Dallas was thinking. I just took a quick look at the criteria on the OARs for the current grants, and it seems like they're short, and maybe having sort of one combined statement on climate change and impacts and mitigation and resilience, to me seems like a good way to kind of have it all together in one package, so it's just one criteria instead of maybe these, if it's the way it is now, it might be a climate criteria with subsets or something, but just kind of keeping it in line with the current criteria would be kind of, is it help watershed health and this and that and climate impacts and resiliency, like so some kind of longer statement with all of these combined. And then the other question I have is, if we were to make these, say we decided on this set of criteria and the board liked them and put them in there, and then 2 years down the line we realized like nobody answered question number 1 very well or something, like would we need to go back and like have a rack and rewrite these rules, or is it better to start kind of broad and like have a kind of a more simple statement, or have it really complicated and then realize later like, oh well, we're really only answering 2 of these very well, so maybe those other ones either we need to work on or they're really hard to address, or whatever the case is.
Yeah, thanks, Heather. I think it's definitely the former. We'd like to keep this broad and not overly complex for a variety of reasons, including what you just described. I do envision at some point, like with all of our rules, we have it's called a 5-year rule review. So after the rules are adopted in 5 years, staff kind of reviews the language, and if there's things that aren't working, that's when we will typically go back to the board and say, hey, we thought this, and as it turned out, it just wasn't easy to implement, and folks didn't know what we were talking about, so let's change it. So I think there's that built-in 5-year period, but then there's nothing stopping staff or the board at any time in the future for saying, hey, this isn't working, or the science has got better, so maybe we can get a little more quantitative here.
Mm-hmm.
We're not there yet, but
Yeah.
Hopefully in the future we will be.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I think I saw Teresa and then Bruce.
Yeah, in responding to the first criteria about engaging the local communities, I think, yeah, I share the same concern with several others where, people could just be checking off the box to fulfill that first criteria. So I think building the language into this criteria, like maybe saying seek to meaningfully engage local communities in the planning or the implementation process of the project. That could be one. Like, it doesn't have to be that specific, but I think building that language into this criteria, the more specific, the better is going to be better. In terms of number combining 4 and 5, I think the main concern that I had when I suggested separating those out is just how for some projects, applicants could easily just only specify addressing sequestration and natural resource and completely left out the human and communities aspect of the criteria. So I'm not opposed to combining the two, but I think it would be important to address the importance of both, which I think is a longstanding common theme for the conservation field, to only think about natural resource and conservation and forgot to think about the human element of this work. I think that is something that's really important to address in the criteria.
Yeah, thanks, Teresa. I think, something that occurred to me, thinking about combining 4 and 5, is that, I'm thinking of projects that are like a forest restoration or resiliency project. And we fund a lot of those where the applicant is proposing to, basically cut down a lot of the small kind of invading like conifers around like an oak project. And that would probably score pretty low when it came to sequestration and storage of carbon there. Maybe not. My ignorance might be showing here, but at the same time, when it comes to adaptation and resilience, that might be scoring pretty high when it came to the review. So that may or may not also lead to kind of combining those two criteria. Just a thought that I had on the types of projects that we are currently funding and have prioritized through programs like the FIP program. Bruce.
Yeah, just a question, and it relates to the lumping. Could we have one more general or more specific ones here? Do each of these grant application types come with a guidance document where OEB staff or the institution explains this is what we mean when we say this and this is what we're looking for? Because I think it would be, if that's the case, it's a lot easier to define these at that level more informally, where clearly some things are not going to be applicable in land acquisition grants or land conservation, or you can just explain that, what are most important within one big criteria or multiples for this particular kind of grant application.
Yeah, absolutely, Bruce. I think it's going to be critical to have good guidance on, whatever we end up with at the end, because it's going to be something new for folks, and we'll want to be absolutely clear as to what these mean. And if we keep it a little bit broad in the rules, we'll need to get specific in that guidance.
Well, the nice thing about that is then you can change that as you learn as you go without having to go through a whole formal rewriting the rules process. And I think you will learn a lot as you go. Every grant cycle will become a little more clear what's working and what's not.
Yeah, thanks for that, Bruce. Okay, great conversation. Guy, I see your hands.
Just a thought of based on that clarity of the application process. Who's going to determine what future for climate change is the one that is going to be used? You know, we have general descriptions here on the North Oregon coast that we're going to have longer, hotter, drier summers, the same amount of rain, but over a shorter period of time. You know, we have some kinds of descriptions. Is OWEB in its, as it puts out things, going to say, here is the climate projection models that we are going to use? Or are you going to leave it up to the individual applicants to kind of pick and choose what their climate model says? It's nothing to do with the language here, but more of a process moving forward.
Yeah, I can take it, Eric, unless you want to respond.
Nope, go right ahead.
We would leave it up to the applicant, to the individual applicant. So we will, our goal, depending on, you know, whatever gets created, is to certainly help to compile those technical resources that are out there and that exist, so that applicants aren't forced to go looking on their own and try to find the information, but that we would in fact at least provide a starting point where, you know, we try to bring together the technical resources that we know of and provide that as part of the guidance for when they're applying. But in the end, we wouldn't say you need to use, you know, this, you know, RCP 4.5 or 8.5, and you need to do it out to 2100. And, you know, we wouldn't be that prescriptive with what you would need to pick. And because it does vary so much, the climate data that's available for the state is so different depending on where you are. The coast is very different than what you're going to get for Willamette Valley than what you're going to get east side. And the scales at which that data is available is so different for our state. So it would be really hard to assign one thing that would apply universally, I think, right now to all of our applicants.
OWEB could assign one source, which obviously every source uses, doesn't project the same future for all the climates that we have in Oregon. But what you're saying is that you will give us, the applicants, kind of a list of sources that you will trust and that you recommend we use. And we pick what source we want and then use whatever climate model that's within that source. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
That's what we're thinking right now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Like what Audrey did for the technical resources that were created for the application questions that were out for the last year. Something similar to that.
Yeah. It included but not limited to. I mean, we don't want to be super prescriptive and then a year later, you know, a great document that comes out on the North Coast and it's not listed in our guidance, so you don't feel like you could use it. You should be able to use it. So we want to provide the resources, but also be flexible in what we're accepting.
Except that you're not going to accept any model that says climate change is not happening, right? So,
wait, yeah, I think within reason.
Yeah. All right.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead, Alex.
Yeah, I was actually going to say something else, but I think Guy brought up something really great, and I'd like to respond to that. So yeah, in grad school for my master's thesis, I wrote a climate change adaptation plan for Michigan Tech's forest. And as part of that, we were analyzing climate change adaptation frameworks. And one of our big criticisms that came out of that was because there's different projections and because climate change is a moving target, how a lot of people have responded to that is sort of just calling anything climate change adaptation, doing that, and then saying that they've done climate change adaptation. But there are sort of somewhat, at least qualitatively accessible things like adaptability, adaptive capacity, and resilience that can be targeted. And so I would be, and I think that's sort of already the direction that we're headed in. I would be in favor of an approach that is sort of making those things the target, and even I would say bolstering the language with that. Not with the, because we're talking about ecosystems, organizations, and communities, and so it's making the language more specific towards those three things is going to come up, or is going to create more meaningful outcomes than sort of dwelling on how climate change is defined and coming up with your own definition and just responding to that. The other thing I wanted to bring up, and this is more what I raised my hand about, is that we've been talking about a focus on adaptation for communities, and I may be totally off base here, but I think in OWEB applications as they currently stand, there's not a whole lot about community resilience, or really there's not a ton of what feels like evaluation criteria for the human component of anything. It does feel like there's a ton of emphasis on anadromy, and so there's a whole drop down section as to whether or not your proposed action is going to benefit anadromous fish, specifically salmon and steelhead. And two things on that is, one is, are we, this is a an unformed thought, I think, at the moment, but are we approaching a territory where we're, I don't want to say pitting, a priority on anadromy against a priority on community resilience? And so that should be something we should consider. And then also along with that, that there's a real fear on our side of the state, specifically in this basin, that there is a point in the future where, due to just the overwhelming impacts of climate change and other infrastructure related things, we may lose anadromy in this basin at some point in the future, and how that would be bad on its own, because that means that endangered species are going to be impacted, but also how is that going to impact our ability as an organization to seek out funding from organizations like OWEB, because that's such a priority for OWEB. And so are we creating an evaluation criteria that's sort of ahead of the rest of OWEB, I guess, in this emphasis on communities, which I think is good. I think we should emphasize communities, but I don't know. Like I said, that's a poorly formed thought at the moment, but I wanted to bring that up.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. And I think I got you. And it's a big conversation there around anadromous fish. And part of it, those check boxes that we have in our application, I know there's many of them when it comes to, fish and, sometimes other listed species, but part of that is just, this is OWEB administravia when it comes to, our funding sources. One of them is federal Pacific coastal salmon recovery. So if we know that certain boxes are checked, we could say, that might be a project, if funded, it could come through the PCSRF grant type. So, but yeah, I think it's definitely a good comment, and we'll need to keep that in mind. Okay, I don't see any other hands up. Yeah, this is a really great conversation. Thank you for that. I think we have a lot to chew on now as staff ahead of the next RAC meeting. So before Jesse stops sharing screen, I do want to say, if there's other thoughts you have on this, or I also know some people may not be available for the next RAC meeting. Please feel free to share over email, or if you want to call, you can check in with either Jesse or myself, and we can kind of talk through either your thoughts, or if you're not available for the next RAC meeting, kind of what came out of that meeting. So please don't think that this is just for the RAC meetings. We're available at really any time. So Jesse, I think you can stop sharing now. And I'm going to pop up just kind of a next steps slide so y'all know where we're at. Okay, so after this meeting, we're going to kind of prepare the staff for an OWEB board climate and water committee meeting. And that's coming up here in a week and a half. And we're going to update the committee members as to, one, we're going to provide the draft language as you saw it today to the committee, and then kind of talk over where we, some of the high points of the meeting today. So, I heard, really strong push for guidance coming out of these rules, the potential to lump where possible the criteria, and really the importance of communicating with communities. We heard that a lot. And I know there's a lot of other great feedback. So we're going to be compiling that and discussing it with the Climate and Water Committee here on the 15th. We have an OWEB staff team, in addition to Jesse and April and I, that are working on this. So we're going to be meeting with them on December 20th. So we'll bring proposed edits to that meeting and come out with a revised set of draft language that we will run by you all on January 6th after the new year. Then bring back those additional edits to the staff team in late January, and then provide that back to you all. Again, it's the third RAC meeting on February 10th. So that's kind of the next steps for the RAC over the next few months. But wanted to see if there are any questions there. Okay. Not seeing any. So I think we are just about done for today, unless there's anything else for the good of the order.
Eric, I just wanted to say,
again.
Oh, can I interrupt you?
Go ahead, Jesse. Nope,
I
go
just
right
wanted
ahead.
to say that I personally, if I were in your shoes and I was looking at this and reflecting on everything, I would want to follow. Like, I do a lot of my thinking after the fact, and so please feel free to take a look at this document. If you commented on it and you want to email us, please do, because that's how I process. I'm not very good at processing real time and providing feedback in an hour. So if you need that time and you want to send email comments, please do. Don't hesitate to reach out with any sort of written comments or wordsmithing. Feel free to track changes the whole document and send us your suggestions. So
can I ask Jesse? This is Guy. and Eric knows I was, looking all through this material over the weekend, and you go down that rabbit hole on Google and start looking for research and other kinds of things that are done. Are there other jurisdictions, states, whatever, that are doing something similar? And is there anything we can learn from what somebody else has gone through?
That is an excellent question. And to my knowledge, the answer is there are some. California, for a while, had a specific program within the Wildlife Conservation Board, which is a little similar to OWEB, state funded, you apply for grants. They had a specific climate adaptation program. So if you go to their website, you can take a look and see some of the open their open application questions that were there for that grant program when it was open. I would say that their application questions and the guidance, it was very specific. So not quite as broad as what we're looking at, but it was things like describe the durability of your investment over a 50-year time frame, talk about so they have very specific, a lot of questions. And let's see, I'm trying to think, there's also a program, I would say that the Wildlife Conservation Society, which is a nonprofit, and they give grants not necessarily to states, they give it to other nonprofits, but they have a specific grant program dedicated to climate adaptation and mitigation. And you can look at their website and see the kinds of questions and resources and guidance that they provide to applicants. They would be another resource to look at. And I have looked at their resources and had some conversations with them as well, just to help inform some of the, what kinds of lessons have you learned after administering a program for 10 years, and I've gotten to see sort of the evolution of their questions. So I'm bringing that to bear as we revise some of these criteria, understanding, what have they learned when they've asked these questions in a certain way and they haven't necessarily gotten the answers they're looking for, and how they've evolved over time. So you can look at their websites, or I can send you a link to them.
Yeah, it'd be great if one of you could just send us both those links. And my caution about California, of course, is what they did with carbon sequestration and how, let's just say, difficult it was to meet any of these standards, and how they used it. I mean, I don't know. It's my experience with carbon in California is not good, but anyways. Oh, good. Yeah, send us those things. That would be helpful.
Okay. Yeah.
Great. Okay. Well, thanks to everyone. This is great, especially first RAC meeting. Fantastic feedback, really. So we'll be in touch soon with the revised draft. But as Jesse said, if there's anything else you'd like us to consider, please send it along. And with that, have a good rest of your day.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.